Next we have Jelena and Anna's going to introduce. Thank you.
Hi, hello. I feel like everyone needed a break, so I have to introduce you now. I'm sorry. So, Jelena Viskovic is an artist working with storytelling and world building. Her work combines installations, cultural elements, and simulation. She uses video game engines to build social research tools, virtual worlds, and social organizational platforms. Her projects have been commissioned by the VNA, Rhizome, the New Institute, and Académie Schloss Solitude and Transmediale. Jelena also works as a technical consultant, software developer on a number of artists and organizations working on the intersection of art and technology. So, thank you. Applause for Jelena.
I'm going to start this talk in which I will talk mostly about my work, but also tie some loosely connected concepts around simulation through talking about it. And I would like to start it with this concept of crystallization, as it is something that has inspired my work and the processes behind it recently. Crystallization happens when something takes a clearly defined shape due to a sudden change in environment. It is an emergent molecular behavior which happens when something in a state of flux, like a liquid, forms into a highly organized solid through a process enabled by pressure or temperature change. This highly organized shape is called a lattice. It is the order of points that define the shape of the crystal. The first step in the crystallization process is called nucleation. It means that crystallization forms around particular points in a homogeneous substance. These points are described in chemistry as anomalous, as they divert from the homogeneous substance. I'm interested in drawing analogies between the process of crystallization and gamification, also quantification and emergent patterns on social networks. I work with video game engines to try to visualize processes for other worlds that provide alternative modes of interaction with complexity. These prototypes for technologies existing in other worlds that can enable different aesthetic and technological frameworks for economic exchange, navigation, relationships, communication, but principally, and this is something that I will focus on in this talk, storytelling. This can be done by prototyping one element in a world that points to a larger feel of what this world, a single element is depicting is. In fiction film, this is done with props. You don't see the whole world, just a certain object or environment that point to what this bigger world is. The prototype on display attempts to create a stateless, decentralized contract platform and a time management tool for unstructured family, kinship, and work relationships. It plays on the idea of wages for housework, a feminist movement from the 70s, but it applies it to contemporary precarious relationships and informal work relations. It is a type of anti-exploitationware that still uses gamification, where care work and interpersonal relationships are quantified and stored in a database, positioned in a world where everything has a clear shape that is decipherable by numbers. This world is not unimaginable in our world. It actually is our world, and this project developed into a real initiative with many contributors. The idea behind this project is the discrepancies that it produces, but what I think is that it has a possibility that crystallization can occur around these discrepancies or these irregular patterns. And by this I mean a highly organized way of using a technology formed around irregular patterns or discrepancies which cannot be quantified. This also points to a larger set of questions to how this quantified data is used and how machines see and foresee the world through operational images. In an essay called Seeing, Naming, Knowing by Nora Khan, she stands in front of a newly installed surveillance camera in Detroit and she writes, "Dread seeps in as I recognize my total lack of access to the logic behind the green light's eye, what it will choose to name from what it sees, and then what it will do with this knowledge." The process of seeing, naming, and knowing, which she talks about in relation to this obscured vision, can be translated to algorithmically encoded protocols for identification, verification, authentication, and authorization. She questions what are the possibilities of there being a misalignment between what the machine sees, names, and knows, and how this knowledge is always instrumentalized for purposes like profit maximization. She also points out the way that the process of seeing, naming, and knowing creates an essence to things and individuals. It generates an over-essentialized self, which is very difficult to revise. This points to a metaphysical ontology in which a predefined essence or form of things precedes the facts that things just are, which is a problem that machines face when things they observe operate in unexpected ways. The trailer you just saw is for Romok, which is a web-based application commissioned by the V&A 2018. It was developed in collaboration with a collective of artists called Rights Network. It attempts to add an element of the unknown, a qualitative, flexible element to this quantified worldview that enables a critical perspective and a human approach, but not through UI or UX design, simplification or gamification, but through defamiliarization or estrangement. The game is based on principles of agent-based simulations, which are a class of computational models for simulating the actions and interactions of autonomous agents with a view to assessing their effects on the system as a whole. The main building blocks of the simulation are so-called active agents that constantly shape and influence their environment based on the user's input, and environmental elements that change according to the active agent's predictions. And this is the game. Can you turn the sound down a bit? The game was originally about creating a sandbox city-state that exists independently of human factors. We were looking for ways to model branching in-game narratives and mechanics that influence the governance of a sandbox world and its regions. We're inspired by the myth of Osiris, a god of the underworld whose body parts were scattered across the Nile and put together by Isis to symbolically reunite the region and its god, converting chaos into order. This inspired us to create an assembly game where the player has to find parts of a mechanism in order to make a simulation work and regulate itself. Through the game, we are testing the role of the player's agency in the artificial world of Romok and how willing they are to contribute to a world that exists for its own purpose and not for the players. Regardless of all the feedback that it gives to the player is obviously doing work for the AI that controls this world. In exchange, it's being given predictions about the future that is based on social media content. Gamification frameworks lay out the structure for analyzing the driving forces behind human motivation. It is the process of applying the imposed core behavior drives that motivate a user to complete a task efficiently through an interactive experience. These frameworks are used in healthcare, fitness, education, training, and product design to increase user engagement and motivation. In this sense, simulation and reality become indistinguishable from one another, and humans become embedded in a digital infrastructure which, by encoding, extracting, and essentializing the world, enforces the techno-imperial colonial power structures. The title of the game is an abstraction of the Hungarian word for ruins. It describes a world which is not there for the player, but the players can contribute to it and indirectly sculpt it with their input. The difference between a typical agent-based model and Romok is that Romok contains a lore. I'm interested in this concept of lores, and I see a lore, a narrative form that is usually used as a base narrative structure in games, as a story that has a mechanic that is actually a process. It directly influences life, and life sort of seeps back into it through the game mechanic. Instead of the simulation controlling the user's behavior, I'm interested in how reality and lived experience can seep into the simulation space. Nirgentime is an ongoing research that uses simulation space to create something between a documentary, theoretical research, and game entertainment. It is also an ongoing archive of documents reimagining contemporary Europe in a fictional space. To create a simulation space that involves qualitative elements, not just from the Western point of view, that doesn't attempt to capture information and benefit from the narrative that it produces. This is from a text that was written by Hungarian theorist Zsolt Miklósvölgyi. He describes the notion of Nirgentime as something that highlights a peculiar ambiguity by combining the semantic fields of nowhere and unhomeliness. If someone comes from Nirgentime, it also means that there is no place to where they could belong. It forces movement and exile without even knowing where one is being exiled from, as he says, being a bastard of no man's land. This cryptic word also names the realm of our contemporary condition, where the contours and directions of speciality are becoming ever obscure and liquid. The main properties of the lore in this game is that it ties loosely connected events with tropes and some sort of a narrative mechanic. It uses a mythological magic quest trope in search for meaning through emotional excesses and immersion. This lore can be defined as a journey through space and time in a traumatized modernist space, but it's also a mechanic that involves the instrumentalization of the player as a tool to observe the space and make connections between events in a non-linear manner, to construct multiple stories and histories of the space. It expands the viewpoint throughout the gameplay as these stories are constructed. It starts inside of a body, where the previously shown excerpt is from, through the interior or a zone where this body finds itself stranded, to an open world where the interior is placed in. However, the linear perception of time and the story is disrupted. The player can also find different artifacts and Easter eggs that are related to the documents found in reality, and all of these have special properties. An example of this is a card, which is from a real tabletop RPG, where the role assigned to the player gives them the ability to control time. This game becomes real since it is played inside of a game. Things that are fictional in the real world become reality and the other way around. The player can see this real fictional card, can use this real and fictional card to time travel and create a connection between events based on images that were created on the construction site of a border between the EU and the rest of the world. This is based on documents from an actual border that was built in Hungary at the time in 2015. The idea of lived experience and sights seeping into the game and altering its mechanic can be imagined the other way around as well, when the lore of the game would bleed into reality and create new possibility spaces in the physical world. Patternist is a video game about urban experience. It adds new layers to the urban infrastructure, adding a new world, literally, on top of the existing one. It is using in-game economy and navigation elements to do this. The players can explore this world through immediate experience, challenging phenomena produced by Google Maps and Pokemon Go, where the player's navigation and actions are controlled by the app. The narrative revolves around discovering a fictional exoplanet that is mysteriously overlaid onto the Earth's surface. The details of this alien planet are revealed through the gameplay and through navigation. The other planet allows different modes of communication, trade, and urban navigation to be used on top of the existing ones that we are familiar with. This new world exists as a gateway to a new infrastructure that works hand in hand with the existing urban infrastructure. In the end, it's like a plug-in reality for the city where players can trade and cooperate with others in a new way. I'm currently looking into metaphysics and mysticism as potential tools for sculpting these new possibility spaces and plug-in realities that game worlds operate in. Chimera is a project in development that is based on research of Federico Campagna, a collaborator of mine and a philosopher who is interested in metaphysics and world building. Chimera is a world in which 4 games are played at the same time. It allows the player to intervene with the creation of a new city through the perspective of different living groups. Depending on whether the player chooses to play as a rock, a fungus, a tree, an animal, an American city planner, or a yet unborn child, their experience of the territory of the city changes radically. The very landscape is different since it is a result of reality manifesting itself through entirely different metaphysical frameworks. The dynamics of the game also change between different characters, as do victory conditions. There are 4 metaphysical frameworks represented in the different characters' viewpoints, so 4 games with different motivations would be played. The 4 different characters perceive the world in different ways in relation to their metaphysical properties. Games and object-oriented programming ultimately work based on the Platonic concept of forms and concrete particulars. A class, in computational terms, is the form that concrete particulars are derived from, and everything in the game is an instance of a class. In games, code precedes the world. So again, representation and lore has a strong role in constructing this world and the rules that define it. The representational elements I chose for this game are based on fabric weaving patterns. According to stories told by weavers from the Balkans, fabric patterns point to origin myths, and they have certain powers and attributes, and their meaning is passed on through storytelling in domestic surroundings. In carpet weaving from the south of Balkans, there is no industrial or mechanized way to weave the carpets, so capitalist modes of production don't apply to them. 1 square meter requires 30 days of full-time weaving. Even though the standardization of the patterns is very important, they do just happen to exist in a timeless manner, in between the realm of standardized and pre-coded and the ineffable. Interesting examples of where processes of quantification and standardization are combined with magic and myth appear in other archaic measuring objects. This object is a water clock. It sits in between being a public fountain and a time measuring device. The word comes from Greek and it means to steal water. It was a time measuring tool that made sound and was detached from the Earth's motion and could therefore be used for flexible measurements like a stopwatch or an alarm clock and create correlations between time and localized motions. There are inscriptions in the water clocks that read things like, to determine the hours of the night when the stars are invisible, or thus the correct hour of the sacrifice can be observed. Following the aesthetic framework of the clepsydra, combined with other archaic leisure and social spaces such as baths and fountains, Forum also adds another component to this mechanism. A database of users, or a social network marked by a chemical crystallization process, which is happening inside of the clock. The interactions of the users of this social network are measured in a water clock, creating a visible simulation of the interactions on the network. The time that is spent interacting with other users of the network is being reused inside of this installation to mark their presence in the public space. In a way, this work portrays a world-building methodology, which is based on taking elements of the present world and molding them into a new one that can encompass multiple stories, crystallize, and become a form of a hyperobject that can be experienced only through a perspectival change or through an encounter with the ineffable, which attempts to point out possibilities for qualitative observations of the world that we live in, but also points out the need for crystallization of emotional entanglements and perhaps mysterious leisure spaces. But we can continue to talk about this.
Okay.
Anna.
Where should we start? I don't know.
1, 2, or 3.
I don't know, 1, 2, or 3.
Let's do it in a reverse way. 3.
Okay, 3. So, you know, we both work with video games, and I'm particularly interested in video games where you don't do much,
Yeah.
right? So there's this idea that completely goes against the leveling up, right? And especially with Romok, you know, when you play it, you kind of look at it. I wonder how you feel about the way in which this sits in the kind of larger world of video game making, especially when you talk about entertainment, right?
Yeah.
Because another question that we both share is, you know, we're working with these tools that are given to us by a certain industry that comes, you know, from like Hollywood, right? And somehow we see this even kind of rippling down in education models, right?
Yeah.
If you think of places like SciArc, or even here, where there's this kind of pressure to understand these spaces, or to see them as the kind of next logical step in kind of representing something.
But also
So-
this pool of that we define as games or simulation is also very large. So we can talk about teaching kind of very like high-end AAA game design in universities, or just trying to define actually how a simulation is in itself is a form of an image that is a result of a very complex process of producing images and information. So in the end, I don't think that, for example, an agent-based simulation is not a game. I don't know. I don't really know how you define what a game is. Like probably leveling up is
Right.
one of the. But I don't want to go
Catching
into
the
the what is a
Pokemon.
game discussion. Yeah, but there's, I think, an interesting in-between space where you take something that is a simulation that is a representational image with a process, and then you also add a narrative layer to it,
Right. So it's
which is, I think, a game where you don't do anything.
right. And how, you know, because narrative is also dangerous, right?
Yeah, of course.
So, and I think that's what I really enjoy about the work you do is the fact that there is always this kind of fallback onto like reality, right?
Yeah.
So you know, you see a lot of artists working with video games and this idea of world building as a kind of, you know, very problematic way to say other world, right? As this projection towards something that's completely different to reality. But somehow in your games, you know, you kind of redirect it back to this world.
Yeah,
Right.
I try to do the opposite of gamification, which I think is taking something that is very real and turning it into something that isn't real at all, that it's just a game or a simulation. And what I'm trying to do is kind of unwrap how these processes are tied into the world that we exist in and are not really detached from reality.
No, sorry, I'm just thinking, do you think that video games in recent years have been instrumental to kind of distracting?
Like in a
Attention.
conspiracy way.
Yeah.
We can talk about conspiracy. Distracting from what?
From what is actually happening, right?
Yeah.
In the real world.
I don't think that there is a very big distinction between the two things, but maybe. What do you think?
I don't know, I feel like sometimes, or the way, you know, the way video games are discussed in popular culture, I'm not talking about art video games. I'm just talking about popular culture in general, that, you know, they are fed to us as these scenarios, often end of the world scenarios, right?
Yeah.
They help us
Okay.
imagine,
I see what you're talking about.
they help us imagine things that are in the end kind of distractions from the actual processes that led us to even play the video game.
You mean like the apocalypse that is
Yeah.
being depicted in a video game
Yeah.
is a distraction from the
Yeah.
real apocalypse?
Yeah.
Yeah. I can agree on that. But how do you think that representation can be helpful or unhelpful in this process?
Oh, I haven't figured that one out. No, but maybe since we're talking about representation, I mean, you didn't show it now, but you were talking a lot about these axioms and diagrams, right? And I also have a particular curiosity with how things are drawn out in order to explain things.
Yeah.
It happens a lot in machine learning papers, right? Where you have these kind of like simplified ideas of like a
But
process.
it happens a lot everywhere. It seems that
Yeah.
everything can be depicted in a diagram, and people love diagrams, and architecture is full of diagrams and processes and systems that can be presented in a diagram. But also, how do you define what the truth, or like what is the building block or the axiom in that diagram that you can trust?
I still find that's the biggest tension I find with like working with video games, is that in the end when you're setting up your scene or your world, you inevitably end up drawing a diagram
Yeah.
somehow.
Yeah, this is where you have to, this is what I was talking about when I was saying that the game has to be coded on the principles of object-oriented programming, which is always the code precedes the world. So there you were never going to get a mystified world that just is.
Right.
There are certain discussions whether artificial intelligence does this in a way, but still code precedes the world. So the only way to kind of change this is through storytelling.
Right. Since you're talking about storytelling, another interesting thing that I think is happening on a larger scale, but it comes through your work a lot, is this return to magic, myth, right? Is it a way to kind of solve all the kind of questions we have, or our kind of smallness in this kind of vast system of representations, networks, etc.? Is it a way to understand the code itself?
No.
What is it in your work?
No,
actually?
but I think that goes back to what I was talking about in relation to lores, that it's like magic is in a way a story that has a mechanic and that impacts the world in a very specific way. So yeah, it also creates kind of connections between things in an unexpected way and brings together things that seem irrational or illogical, still in a logical manner. Like there is always logic to something that is mystical or magical.
What do you
Or
mean?
there's always like a process behind it.
And how it's kind of
How this world is constructed
Right.
and what impacts what. It's always very relational.
I mean, we could keep going on, but
Yeah, but
I think we're kind of short on time.
late anyways. Yeah.
So, but thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks
Anna.
Okay, so Jaya Brekke is a founding member of the Magma Collective, a planetary think and do tank, currently developing peer-to-peer cloud system, Cobox. She holds a position as ESRC Research Fellow at Durham University, Geography Department, and is a scientific coordinator on the advisory board of Decode, Horizon 2020 project furthering citizen-owned data infrastructures and economies for the public good in the context of smart cities in Europe. Jaya has been working in a research, curatorial, and design capacity on projects related to technology and power and the political economies of infrastructures for the past 10 years. She's the author of the Satoshi Hippocratic Oath for blockchain developers and co-author of the white paper published by Ignota Press, republishing and historical contextualization of the Bitcoin white paper. She's mostly based in London, from where she contributes to European cultural policy and industry, debates on blockchain and the development of decentralized network technologies, as well as educational material, furthering critical thinking amongst technologists and startups. Thanks, Jay.
Thanks. I think you got the long blurb there. Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. I have to admit, a little bit tired because I've been sitting through some intense negotiations at the European Commission for a blockchain prize that spilled over into this morning also. But there was a kind of, the reason why I mentioned that is not just to kind of excuse myself, but also because there was an interesting moment in those negotiations where, so I was on the board with a bunch of other juries from lots of different backgrounds and so on. And one of the jury members at one point got a bit anxious about one of the projects that we're reviewing. And she said, but we won't know what's going on outside the chain, you know, and she's talking about the blockchain here, and the blockchain as the idea of a kind of immutable record of incorruptible data. And so there was this kind of anxiety of the stuff that doesn't get recorded. And I think in the case of blockchain, it's a very specific kind of anxiety that comes up, and I want to talk a little bit about that. But I want to kind of talk about two forms of anxiety of the insensible, that is the way that I want to try and describe it. And it's drawing a little bit on some work that I did last year in my, well, my PhD that I completed last year. And one of the chapters talks, you know, is a kind of trying to conceptualize some of these anxieties through the idea of the insensible. And I talk about the insensible as something that is both a kind of insensible, an anxiety around the insensible that's outside of the machine, but also an anxiety of the insensible that is in the machine, the kind of the ghost of the machine, let's say, the ways that algorithms behave that we cannot quite understand, and why does it give us these results, and can we really unpack the black box and this kind of thing. So I feel a little bit like a guest here, but also a kind of very welcome guest, because I think the way that the symposium has been going so far, you know, my impression is that this is a room full of people who are super aware of the kind of political economies of images and image production. And that's something that I think, you know, in some ways, in a lot of debates and kind of policy debates and debates amongst technologists that work with questions of surveillance and privacy, they're lacking a little bit this sense of the kind of the detail that's involved in how things are made visible. So not just is it visible or not, but who is it made visible to? And not just visibility, but legibility, really. So what is the form of the visibility takes? You know, is it a data set or is it an image, you know? And I think, again, this is a kind of audience that is very aware of the kind of power dynamics implicit in those differences of representation. But it's something that I think, you know, could kind of have a lot more weight, or should have a lot more weight in debates around privacy and surveillance. So let's see. Just a little bit of a kind of prelude into this concept of the sensible that I'm working with. In my PhD, I kind of articulated it as one out of 3 concepts that became the kind of framework of my PhD. So the insensible, there was the insensible, the sensible, and the dissensible. So the idea was working a little bit with 3 main theorists that I used to kind of really work through these concepts. Karen Barad, some of you might know, featured kind of a lot, but she has a very neat way of tying together the ways that sensing apparatuses relate directly to knowledge production, and the way that knowledge production relates very directly to the ability to make new things come to matter, so a kind of ontological process. And so, you know, she kind of formed, you know, the basis of this thinking of why work with the concepts of sensible rather than just kind of politics or other concepts. So that has to do with, you know, and then also drawing a little bit on the work of Rancière and the way that politics is thought through as this kind of distribution of the sensible and then a disruption of the distribution of the sensible. So where before, you know, we might have a common sense understanding of how things are, who's allowed to speak in which spaces, who's not allowed to speak, how we move through space and so on. A kind of common sense, you know, politics is the disruption of that common sense. which I then also kind of elaborate a little bit on as a kind of dissensible. So the meeting of incompatible sensibilities. And what I like about working with these concepts specifically is because they kind of fit quite neatly in, it's a way of dealing with legibility and visibility that crosses not just human, but also algorithmic modes of sensibility, and sensing devices, and also all other forms of non or more than human sensibilities, right? So it kind of opens up the debate a little bit and makes opens up the debate of especially surveillance and privacy questions to a kind of broader spectrum of scenarios that isn't just about a panopticon of the state or whatever else, but we can start looking at algorithms in more complex digital geographies that also cross the kind of human, non-human kind of distinction. So that's a little prelude, and then I want to kind of talk a little bit about this kind of the anxiety of the insensible externally to the machine, and the anxiety of the insensible internally to the machine. Give me 1 second, I'm going to drink a little bit of water. So my area of focus has been, in the past few years, very much looking at blockchain technology. And the kind of initial questions that I was asking was very much about how do we understand this new technology politically. And so I've done a lot of kind of like tracing and understanding the architectures and so on and so forth. And there is this, I guess what I want to try and work through is, why you had someone like this person at the European Commission, get so anxious about, what about all that isn't on, that doesn't get captured by the blockchain. So to give a little bit of background, just to explain a bit more the proposition of the blockchain, it's this idea that, when you have a decentralized network that is provably decentralized, then you can also prove that no one in the network is able to fully control it. So if there's no node that controls, how information circulates, then that kind of deals with one element of centralization in terms of like making truth statements or whatever else, or determining, what the condition of the network, the circulation of information in the network, and so on. So decentralization, it's this idea of resolving to some degree a problem of power in a sense. And then, the idea with the blockchain is you have a kind of recorded ledger of statements. In the case of Bitcoin, that would be transactions. In the case of other blockchain projects, it could be a number of other things. And that record of truth statements is held by anyone in the network, any node in the network. And so there's no one that's able to determine what is going to be in the ledger. And that's combined with cryptographic hashing. And cryptographic hashing is a mathematical process whereby it's a super interesting mathematical phenomenon that I would encourage anyone to study, because there's lots of interesting things that can be done with cryptographic architectures. But on a very basic level, cryptographic hashing is a mathematical phenomena whereby if you take any piece of information and run it through this hashing algorithm, it'll spit out a number. That number will be unique to the information that's gone through that hashing algorithm. So if anything happens, if anything gets changed in the original data, you can run it through that hashing algorithm once more, and if the result is different, something has been changed. So what that can be used for is a whole number of things, but amongst other things, it can be used to prove that a given piece of data has not been altered. And so in the blockchain, you combine decentralization with cryptographic hashing. It's this idea that you have a ledger of statements of things, events, for example, transactions or any other type of event, that first of all, no one controls because it's decentralized, and second of all, no one can alter what's been recorded in the event because of cryptographic hashing. And if anyone alters it, people will know. And so, the blockchain has been kind of, if you guys have kind of been bypassing the headlines, good for you, but oftentimes it's described as solving the trust problem, and it solves the trust problem exactly for these reasons, that no one is in control of the ledger, no one can alter the ledger without everybody else knowing it and without it running through the kind of like consensus algorithm. I can go into lots of more detail, but I don't think it's necessary for this argument. So what that means is, the kind of trust problem that it solves. The blockchain's been called this kind of trustless architecture because you do not need to trust any authority or anyone else in order to trust the information that's held on the ledger. The information has been arrived in a decentralized manner where it's proven that no single entity can kind of control that information. And it's provably not been altered because of the cryptographic hashing. And so it's this trustless layer. And so this produces this very kind of like particular type of anxiety of the insensible that we saw in the European Commission, but also that you see in lots of other blockchain projects that tend to want to put more and more things onto the chain. Because if it's not on the blockchain, we can't prove it. We cannot prove that it actually happened. And so there is this particular kind of set of affordances that come with this form of producing truth statements, let's say, of making visible certain things that happen, let's say, where anything that's not placed onto this particular way of recording how, what has happened becomes increasingly suspicious, right? So it's this, and there are other authors that have noted how, rather than the trust machine solving the trust problem, in fact, it sows distrust in lots of other processes because anything that's not on the chain, cannot be trusted. And so, this is one of the kind of like problems that we see play out like on a regular basis in blockchain technology, this need to monitor more and more relationships, this need to kind of like add more and more of these both relationships and things, through the spread of IoT devices and whatnot, onto the blockchain, and that tends to be represented in very particular manners. So that's a little bit of a story of the one form of anxiety outside of the machine and why there is this need to bring things more into the machine or expand the machine in more and more fine-grained matters into more and more objects and devices. A little pause. That was a lot to take in, especially for people who've not heard about blockchain. The second kind of anxiety, could be, I guess, partially described as the type of anxiety that those who are not so into machinic forms of truth-making tend to have in response to the blockchain, right? Or tend to have in response to algorithms, is, the kind of the way that, the machine is going to dominate more and more and more of our lives. How, what does this machine, what are these algorithms really doing? Can we open the black box and understand what's really going on? And there's many reasons to try and open black boxes, but you'll likely find more and more black boxes. And that's not to say, inside the box, right, you keep opening and there's more elements and so on. That's not to say it's a useless exercise. It's just to say it gives, there are different views. There's different forms of legibility in terms of how to understand the politics and dynamics of different forms of algorithmic systems. There are some theorists that are trying to kind of work through in a bit more detail this form of opacity and how to kind of think with that form of opacity. Jenna Burrell is one of them. She works on opacity in machine learning. And Louisa Moore is another one. She works on cloud geographies. And kind of her ways of describing cloud geographies is a little bit like, sure, we can look at how an algorithm operates, but that won't tell us much because really what happens is very much in relation to dynamic data sets, right? So the effects of a given algorithm, it's hard to kind of determine that on the outset because it depends on a kind of, oftentimes real-time shifting datascapes, let's say. So a form of kind of cloud geography, she talks about it very evocatively. It's, clouds that kind of unfold and they take new shapes and, a kind of nebulous thing. Does that mean that we can never fully know what the politics are of a given algorithm? Does that mean that we'll never fully understand what's at stake? So before I answer that question, which is a very important question, just to talk a little bit about the kind of exercise that I did in my PhD trying to find out about this question of trustlessness that I just introduced to you before. So, here I was faced with a bunch of computer engineers, and I fully trusted these computer engineers. They're fantastic at their job, and what they do is they create deterministic systems. That's you know, the job of a computer engineer. And they had a bunch of security modeling and so on the decentralized network protocols they were designing. And you know, they work with models of trustlessness, trustless thresholds, and so on. And they say this, you know, this protocol has a trustlessness threshold of, you know, 50% or whatever, which means, you know, if 50% of the nodes get together and decide what they want to have happen, then they can decide what happens in the network, right? So, you know, a very kind of, you know, they had their models and their formulas and so on around when something is trustless and when something is not. And then, you know, you look around and then you see kind of various cryptocurrency exchanges being done for fraud. You see, you know, various ICO projects come and go. People lose their money. And it's very clear that, you know, from most people's perspective, this is hardly a trustless system. In fact, a lot of trust is required in order to use these systems, and that trust tends to be broken. You know, that trust is often broken. People lose their money. There are scams that happen all the time. And so kind of, you know, struggling a little bit with putting these two things together, where, you know, one argument would be that, oh, but it's because, you know, the system wasn't fully implemented yet, or we hadn't quite, you know, whatever else. But it's a repeated issue across multiple blockchain projects. And so, you know, it was me trying to kind of intellectually grapple a little bit with, you know, how does this kind of rigorous process and modeling around developing trustless deterministic contexts simply not match up with, you know, the trust problem of social relations and so on. So in my process of trying to work out that question, I was, in my head, I had this idea of getting close to the machine. I was like, okay, there must be a trustless core, right? There must be kind of, you know, if I look at the code on GitHub, will I find trustlessness, right? If I speak to the core developers of Bitcoin, will they be the only ones that are truly engaging with the system in a trustless manner? And in actual fact, you know, what you find is even a core developer in Bitcoin, like in terms of a kind of like social understanding of trust, needs to trust, for example, the kind of mathematical community in their development of the SHA-264 hashing algorithm. And so, you know, there is no way of developing the system in which a single person engages with that system in a truly trustless manner, because you're constantly actually relying on communities of people that trust and peer review each other and go through processes of, you know, working things out and so on and so forth. And so there was no pure core to the machine. All there was different relationships, right? And so in answer to this question of how to find this kind of this nebulous, how to kind of make sensible the insensible ghost in the machine, you know, there is always going to be the insensible element, you know, in the sense that things are always unfolding. But I think the important element is that is not actually what's necessarily required in order to have an ethical or political understanding of what's going on, exactly because there are different views and all of those views matter, whether you might be considered close to the machine in the sense of literally writing the code and committing it to the GitHub repository, or far from the machine, which I still don't think is very far. You have your wallet on your phone, or your Bitcoin wallet on your phone or whatever, and that is another interface, and the effects, what happens at that interface is no less important. Meaning, if that's not working, you know, so what I'm trying to empower here is a little bit the ability to critique things regardless of the expert knowledge that people tend to feel like they need to have in order to actually address algorithmic systems. You know, like I think it's perfectly valid to say, I don't know how this works at all, but I can see repeatedly it's having pretty terrible effects, and you can critique that, you know? And so just as, you know, the core developers for a given repository or whatever else, you know, they can critique badly written code. Of course, that's their view, that's their relationship, you know. So that's kind of how I, you know, that's how I would deal with the insensible in the machine, let's say. I think I might just end it there. There is a bit of waffle at the end, you know. Yeah, I mean, we could get into a bit of a kind I could talk more about privacy and visibility. No, I'm going to end it there. I think, is that okay? Yeah? Good.
Let's start.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for being here still. I'm really excited, in a sense. The last talk, but one that I think really brings together a lot of kind of the thinking and the underlying ideas in both the exhibition and the program. So delighted to introduce Shumon, who has been one of the kind of key, let's say, forces in programming the AA over the last decade almost. And so Shumon is a writer, curator, and cultural critic. He's a commissioner of Global Art Forum in Dubai, editor-at-large of Tank magazine, contributing editor at Bidoon, adjunct curator at Art Jamil, and a member of Fanjotjon Prada's Thought Council. Together with Douglas Copland and Hans-Ulrich Obrist, he's co-author of The Age of Earthquakes, A Guide to the Extreme Present, and co-curator of the exhibition Age of You, which was shown at MoCA Toronto and is forthcoming at the Jamil Art Center Dubai. So please join me in welcoming Shumon.
Thank you so much. So before I start, I'd like to thank Anna and Moad for the invitation. It's really an honor, but also a pleasure to be in company of so many friends, allies, comrades, brain crushers. I don't know how much of an honor it is to go almost last, although I realize 5 p.m. on a Friday is a historically hallowed slot. It's when Mark Cousins would do his Friday lectures. So in that sense, I feel auspiciously vibey. I certainly know that it's almost impossible to follow from Jaya's searing brilliance. So right now, I'm feeling both blessed, bless up, and also maybe slightly cursed. The question is, how are all of you feeling? Well, you are all of these things, all of them. In 1967, what was Marshall McLuhan? He was famous thanks to this book. The Medium is the Massage was produced by Jerome Agel, designed by Quentin Fiore, and went on to become a mainstream cult success, selling apocryphally, certainly over 1 million copies. Agel, as the producer of this project, compressed Marshall McLuhan's complex acrobatic thoughts about electric media into something, quote, a 10-year-old can understand. I think it's a fantastic brief, you know? Badiou for 10-year-olds, Deleuze for 10-year-olds. But without necessarily sacrificing the complexity. I mean, how can one compress it so that it manages to communicate the essence without sacrificing depth? And Quentin Fiore, as the designer, gave visual shape to these compressions, creating what he described as a dialogue between the computer and the book. The result was a dizzying tour through psychological, social, and emotional change. And I particularly like the way in which Jerome Agel, oh, hi, Mark. You should be up here, by the way. It's 5 o'clock on Friday. So Jerome Agel, in the lead up to the Media Massage coming out, described the book as it predicts the present. It predicts the present. And this is a term that I want you to kind of park in your mind for the next 15, 20 minutes or so. In 2015, Douglas Coupland, Hans-Ulrich Obrist, Wayne Daly, and I produced this, The Medium is the massage updated for the 21st century. Since Marshall McLuhan died in 1980, he never got to see the digital world that we now viscerally inhabit, although in many ways he sensed it coming. For the age of earthquakes, we invited 35 artists to provide imagery and assembled a black and white paperback wired for eyes and fingers accustomed to swiping or scrolling. Have you maybe noticed our lives are no longer feeling like stories? Our lives have become a lineup of tasks. Our sense of time is beginning to shrink. We invented 28 neologisms, new words, because new feelings require new words. One of them was proceleration, which is the acceleration of acceleration. And I wanted to give an example of this, something very concrete and something very familiar, perhaps. My example is January 2020, which technically just finished 2 weeks ago. But I urge you to go and look at the Wikipedia page for January 2020. It starts with Australia's bushfires, which may have caused as many as 1 billion deaths of animal life. Then the assassination of General Suleiman, which put the Middle East yet again on the precipice of another war. We had immediately, it was interesting, as soon as the spectral threat of this war was allayed, we then had the crisis of Megxit. Meghan and Harry left the UK to Canada. Side note, strangely enough, two otherwise kind of Rosencrantz and Guildenstein of history, Canada and Ukraine, are now playing central role in contemporary politics. Who'd have thought? So we had Megxit, then we had Jared Kushner's so-called peace plan for Palestine and Israel. We, of course, had the admission of the beginning of the coronavirus arriving, although, of course, it really started in December, but the news had been suppressed by the authorities in Wuhan for a number of weeks. And then, as if this was not enough, at the very last hour of January 31st, the UK finally, legally left the EU, literally on the last hour of January the 31st. So I'm leaving a lot out of this, but I urge you to have a look at Wikipedia, January 2020. So this is to give you an example of, I think, of proceleration. And I think it's one of the hallmarks of the moment that we're now living in. So when did things really start to procelelerate? No surprise. Sorry. So when did things really start to procelelerate? No surprise, it was 2016. And by early 2017, many of us were in a kind of PTSD. And maybe some of you even remember this feeling. Since that moment, it's become clearer that the 21st century's most valuable resource is you, with all your online behaviors and enriched data sets and millions of metadata points. And if data is the new oil, then 2016 was the equivalent of a global oil spill, which can't be reversed. Netflix documentary from last year, The Great Hack, showed how and why data is at the center of our daily news cycles. When those 2016 events happened, we assumed that this was just a glitch in the algorithm of history, the end of the hegemony of well-educated liberals. Hello, age of stupid. But now we realize that it was, in fact, engineered. There was nothing accidental or providential about it. It was all engineering. Whoever controls data has the power to swing elections, dismantle truth, and redefine the very terms of reality. It's a new world of seductive untruths. The line dividing you and data is long gone. Now, all of this is the backdrop to our forthcoming book, The Extreme Self. My slides are slightly out of order. Let's see if this works. So The Extreme Self is a new kind of graphic novel about what happened to you from 2016 to now. The images inside are portraits and self-portraits sourced from 70 different contributors, some of whom are in this room today. Yeah, so here's the list of our contributors. We asked them to send portraits, self-portraits, portraits of crowds, and that's because we say that there's no escaping your face. You are your face, you become your face, you became your face, or you end up with the face that you deserve. And of course, the face is somehow now a kind of metric, the almost irreducible unit that's now fueling this kind of age of data capitalism. I want you to imagine Morgan Freeman reading this line next. I can't do his voice, but pretend. So if you're wondering why the inside of your head feels so strange these days, this book has the answers. So here's how it starts. Sorry, the slides are kind of all wonky. So the 20th century was about what belongs to who. The 21st century is about who belongs, about who belongs to what. For thousands of years, Earth's resources have been extracted by bodies, most of who were not free. But now it's our bodies, ourselves being extracted, and mostly we offer it up for free. By merely existing, you're leaving a huge data smudge in the world, but it's not the physical world, it's up in the cloud forever. The cloud is the new infinity. We never had to think of our data as being a valuable commodity before. Everyone talks about their data, but what does data even look like? And even if you saw it, would you know what to do with it? What is the opposite of you? The opposite of the self is no longer the crowd. The opposite of man is no longer nature. Feelings now legitimize lies. Could the expression of empathy be our new Turing test? Welcome to the age of you. So if McLuhan was our guiding light for the first book, this time it's Eric Hobsbawm's The Age of Extremes, which came out in 1994. But in particular, the full title of the British edition, which is Age of Extremes, A History of the Short 20th Century, 1914 to 1991. So we've taken the chapters from Eric's book, And we've then updated them to now. So the kind of skeleton of the Age of Extremes is the skeleton of our book. So I thought I'd share a few more pages that will be relevant to, I think, today's discussions, to the theme of this event. Do you still feel like an individual? 20 years ago, this question would have made no sense. Now everybody knows what it means. We all know that we're changing inside our heads quickly, too quickly. Up until recently, people were simply people. Now we're turning into something else. We all feel it. We all know it. Anyone over 40 knows what classic individuality felt like. Now it's almost a handicap. Autophobia, the fear of being an individual. What if we need a new word to describe this thing that individuality is morphing into? You're now becoming your extreme self, and it's happening to you as you read these words. Who, me? Yes, you. A large part of you has been extracted from you, and ever larger part of you now exists everywhere and nowhere. It's both voluntary and involuntary. It exists independently of your 5 senses. There's never been anything like this before, and it will continue even after you die. We're not interested in other people so much as we're obsessed with how they present themselves. How are they formatting their data stream? How can I morph into them? History no longer applies to you. Whereas 20th century history tends to be characterized through geopolitics, i.e. the 2 world wars, the Cold War, the war on terror even, could the battleground of 21st century history be decreasingly geopolitical and increasingly about geoselves? The age of you is the new age of extremes. So in 2017, whilst we certainly were in this state of PTSD about what had just happened in 2016, November Painter, who's the artistic director at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Toronto, initiated this whole project by inviting us to create a new exhibition. We called it Age of You. So from last September to January just past, visitors were able to walk through a preview of our book, which was set over 2 of the museum's vast post-industrial floors. The building used to be an aluminium factory built in the 1910s, so already a kind of museum about the transformation of spaces of work to spaces of culture and the economy of culture, of course. Arrows on the floor, taken from Google Maps, directed you to the next chapter. In addition to the pages, we arrayed a dozen installs which addressed the question of the extreme self. I don't have time to go through all of these in detail, but they included, for example, Mirror Cookie, a film installation by Sofia Almeria, a set of photographs from Farah Al-Qasimi, a film called Red Film by Sarah Swinar, the campaign materials for Craig Green's collaboration, or capsule collection, I should say, for Montclair from the spring-summer 2019 collection, 2 film installations by Victoria Sin, a fantastic new commission by the Japanese photographer Satoshi Fujiwara called Crowd Landscape. But I would like to quickly pick out a few of these that talk to the topic of data and selfhood and portraiture, and to call back to something that Anna mentioned in the introduction early this morning. What happens when images begin to look back at us? So, for example, at first glance, these prints, so there are 2, they're 4 meters high, about just under 2 meters wide. I think you'll agree, they appear monochromatic, abstract. Different people, I've asked, see different things. White straight men say they see boobs, but then they tell me they see boobs everywhere, so I don't know how relevant that is. But in fact, what we're looking at here are images of a smudged screen of a mobile phone. In this case, one belonging to the artist Stephanie Saad. The smears and fingerprints create a biotechnological extension of the intimate self, and a reminder that data can leave a physical history too. So here's the thing, if all of us turned our phones off right now, laid it down flat, and had a very high resolution photograph taken of that surface, they would be as unique and as your face, as your fingerprint. It's a constantly evolving animated kinetic portrait of each of us. And it's a kind of, but it's a collusion of different kinds of matter, technological matter, but also biological matter, and also a history of gestures. So that line at the top is obviously the last swipe that Stephanie did on her screen before she turned it off for it to be photographed. Or here, where Yuri Patterson created a new commission using a single row of eye emojis, one from each popular platform, one from Apple, Google, Samsung, WhatsApp, and Facebook. He enlarged them and generated a pattern with an open source software that uses a content array algorithm. The result seems superficially cute, but also hides something technologically eerie. In AAI, which stands for Artificial Intelligence, Agnieszka Kurant proposes an alternative method of artwork production, cross-species collaboration. She outsourced the sculpture's creation to termite colonies, providing colored sand, gold, and glitter for the insects to burrow in. When the insects finished their work, she coated their mounds in varnish, making their collective labor permanently visible. So each of these took about 6 months to make. Initially, she went to Namibia, where, of course, the termites are found indigenously, but it was impossible to then export those sculptures from Namibia back to the US, for example. So these were actually created in different universities, such as the University of San Diego. And a lot of Agnieszka's work, I've just done an interview with her in the new issue of Tank magazine, for example, is about forms of collective intelligence, but particularly forms of collective intelligence elicited between humans and non-humans, kind of interspecies intelligence. Do you have the sound? Sound. it's okay. I'll just scroll back. Okay, there should be sound. Imagine a beautiful soundtrack from Holly Herndon. So the flurry of images that make up Trevor Paglen's Behold These Glorious Times come from machine learning libraries. These machine learning libraries teach computer systems to recognize objects and to automate human emotions and expressions. Power increasingly belongs to those who control these invisible images. And of course, invisible images is, I think, a really important and even canonical text by Trevor that was published in the New Review a couple of years ago. And I think it was interesting when Lawrence was talking about sound as a kind of poor image. Perhaps the most high-resolution image today is precisely the one that we can't see anymore, right? So, but resolution in that sense, I think, has to be redefined in terms of, you know, a new metric for defining power, like the power of an image, has less and less to do with its optical performativity, right? Like it's to do with its what Trevor would call its operative performativity. Its operative performativity is intrinsically linked with it not being able to be seen by us, right? So I mean, I think this is really where we, in very crude terms, this is where we are in terms of like the culture of images, a post-optical, operational realm of image power. Trevor had a solo show. I mean, all this work is linked at the Curve at the Barbican, and he's been doing important work with Kate from the AI Now Institute, and a really great show that's still up at the Osservatorio space in the Fondazione Prada in Milan, which is the first history of these teaching libraries, of images used to teach machines how to see. This one, yeah. And in 1 hour of imaginary celebrities, researchers from NVIDIA trained a general adversarial network using 30,000 celebrity photos. So every face you see here looks uncannily real or even familiar, but none of these people actually exist. Instead, it's a portrait gallery of data-drawn selves. Now, next to the NVIDIA imaginary celebrities was this, an unintended death mask of David Bowie. It was sourced from a makeup artist at the BBC who put it on eBay in 2014. But then David Bowie died in early January 2016. And we contend with all serious and somber gravity that David Bowie's death in early 2016 is the beginning of the strange, anxious, extreme time that we're all trying to cope with. Thank you for listening to my TED Talk.